I'm Jane.
I'm Ash Regan. I'm the member of the Scottish Parliament for Edinburgh Eastern.
And I'm Bex,
And this is
Insightful Sisters.
Hello. We're here tonight with Ash Regan, MSP and Parliamentary Leader for the Alba Party. Ash was formerly the Minister for Community Safety in the SNP government until 2022, and then she resigned in protest to the government's gender recognition bill. Ash, what happened then?
Yes, so I was the minister in Nicola Sturgeon's government. So I got elected in 2016. I was made a minister in 2018, and I was minister for about 4.5 years. But when it got to the point of voting on what some people consider now to be a very notorious piece of legislation, which was the Gender Reform and Recognition Bill, as it was at that point, I decided that I could not, in good conscience, vote for a bill that I thought would endanger the safety, privacy, and dignity of women and girls. Obviously, when you're a minister, you're bound by something called collective responsibility. So that means that everybody in the government signs up to be supportive in public at all times of any stated government policy position legislation. So my options were that if I didn't want to vote for it, really I had to resign from the government, which I did do.
I just, in preparation for this, I just reread your chapter in The Women Who Wouldn't Wished. It's quite staggering to think of the machinations that go on behind the scenes, but also the stress that that puts on everybody involved. I mean, you talk in there about going home and thinking about what was going to happen at home with your boys and playing it where you're going to go back in and vote, or where you're going to vote from home because you knew the pressure you were going to. I mean, it must have been a terrific pressure.
Yes, I mean, well, first of all, very few people resign from government, and almost all the people that resign from government are resigning because they've been caught in a scandal, or they're about to be caught in a scandal, or they're about to be sacked for incompetence. So it's very, very, very unusual to resign on a point of policy. It's almost unheard of, because you can imagine people get into politics. Generally speaking, they've got into government, they're ambitious, they want to use their position that they've got in order to do as much as they can. And generally speaking, once people get into government, they want to stay there. They want to continue to be ministers. So it is quite a big decision to take. And I think when you have children, and my children are much older, so they're 21 now, but I've just trying to do the quick maths. And I think at that point they probably were still at school, and they would probably within a few months be making the transition to university. And I'd obviously heard that universities were particularly plagued, maybe is the right way of putting it, with certain types of ideology and certain narrow ways of thinking. And I didn't want my kids to start their university life and being unsafe, and I just didn't want that. Luckily, it's got a different name from me, which I think helps. But yeah, it's not always just thinking about how this is going to affect you, but obviously lots of people, and I mean, I've heard J.K. Rowling talk about this as well, that you worry about the choices that you've made having negative effects on the other people that you love, your family, your children, etc.
Yeah, yeah. It was a very brave thing to do. And I imagine that you were torn because the ministerial responsibilities you had for community safety, that will have included women's safety. So you were at the sharp end.
It did. And also, usually you're in the process of doing certain pieces of work. In the UK, I think that they say the average length of tenure for junior ministers is about 11 months. You can't really achieve anything in 11 months, but I've been in post for over 4 years. There were many pieces of work that I'd started that I'd either seen through or I was in the process of seeing through. And one of the pieces of work that I was really keen to really get moving was changing the law on prostitution. So having to weigh up, do I resign and not be able to pursue this, or do I stay, potentially not vote with my conscience, just keep my mouth shut effectively in order to try to do good work elsewhere. And I think that, from what I've read about other ministers or even backbenchers, even backbenchers are not allowed to vote against the government, except in very, very, government, I mean, backbenchers of the government party. Very small circumstances, sometimes you can get an authorised abstention, something like that. So it can even in politics affect your career very negatively, even just as a backbencher if you choose not to vote with the government. So It's not something that people take lightly when they're in politics, but I'm not sure the public understand maybe how much it isn't the done thing to go against the government like that. I think there is a bit of a perception with the public that I'm the representative of Edinburgh Eastern, and therefore I should be voting with what the people of Edinburgh Eastern want, how they've expressed that to me, that that's my job to go in and represent them by voting in that way. I mean, firstly, my constituency is full of people with a whole range of views, so it's quite unlikely that you'd be able to get a very clear majority for one political or another, although that does happen. But for the most part, really, you are there to follow the party whip. You are there to vote as the party instructs you to do.
So you've got the greater freedom now of being in Alba, and you can really promote the prostitution bill. So tell us about that. Tell us how it came about, what happened, what was the background?
So I've been working on this probably for over about 10 years now, because there was a Labour MSP called Rhoda Grant, and she had tried to, and she wasn't the first either. So there have been a number of people who've tried to change the law on prostitution over the 25 years of the Scottish Parliament. But she was the most recent one to do it. So I think that was around about 2013, I think it was. And I actually wasn't elected at that time, and I was trying to help her to see if we could get that through. And I was writing to MSPs and asking them to support it and things like that. But unfortunately, it didn't meet the initial criteria, which is you have to receive the support of 18 MSPs, that's out of 128, and it has to be cross-party. So there's various kind of thresholds that you have to meet, and it unfortunately didn't meet those, and so it couldn't progress. So I've been working on this for a long time, and obviously when I was in post, prostitution, violence against women and girls, parts of it anyway, were within my portfolio. And so I met with a lot of support services that work in this area. I met with a number of victims of human trafficking. I met with women who work with survivors. I met with survivors who are also campaigners for changes in the law, and so on. So I've met really quite a broad range of people who have quite a lot of expertise in this area over a decade. So I got to the point after I left government where I thought, I don't think the government are going to do this now, because obviously I was in government and I could feel there was a resistance against me progressing this policy in government. Although I did have it on the slate. We have something called like the forward look for legislation, and it kind of maps out this at the beginning of a session, what will be year one legislation, what will be year two legislation, and so on. And it's obviously subject to change, but I did have it on there as it was around about year four legislation. So that would have been last year if that had happened. But I felt there was quite a strong resistance to it. So after I left, I waited a little bit of time, had a conversation with the minister who took over from me and said, look, I want to progress this. This is when I was still in the SNP, got the okay to do that. And then obviously once I changed over to Alba, I've just continued that. So I'm now doing it as what's called, what they call it in the Scottish Parliament is a members bill. And normally you would get the support of something called the NGBU, which would help you to do the drafting and fill out the technical documents and run the consultation and do all of those things. But they didn't have capacity because they were supporting too many to be able to give me support, other members who were also doing members' bills. And so I've had to do this just with my individual staff team. So it's a huge undertaking to be doing legislation just with your own staff team. I've got incredible staff who really have risen to the challenge. So that's been great. And but it is, I don't think people should underestimate sort of the level of challenge that this presents, trying to do this by yourself. So we were delighted when we got to past all the hurdles, getting the cross-party support, and then lodging all the documents that in the right way that the Parliament would accept them and say that this was, met all the technical details that we needed to meet. And that we did that on the 20th of May. We had a press event at the Scottish Parliament to which most of the Scottish press corps, to give them their due, came along. We had a survivor, Fiona Broadfoot, who came to speak. And we also had Linda Thompson to represent, support services and their perspectives on this, and generated quite a lot of press coverage, which I think is important because it helps to let the public understand what we're trying to do and why we're trying to do it, which I think is an important part of it. And then the first part of that process was that I appeared in front of the Criminal Justice Committee, which is the committee that will now be taking the bill through the stages. But the next big challenge is that once the stage one has been completed, so the committee at the moment is doing what's called a call for views at the moment. So it's not really like a consultation, but it's similar. So anybody that's got expertise or strong views in this area can fill that in and write to the committee. The committee will then go through this, and that's where they draw from to find witnesses that will come in and give evidence in person to the committee. They'll then do a number of evidence sessions, probably including asking me to come back again. They'll certainly hear from the government minister who's responsible for this area of policy as well. And then they'll write a report. Then we'll go into the chamber to debate it for what's called the stage one debate. And there's a vote at the end of that. And if I don't get a majority of votes, the proposal will fall and it won't progress any further. So if anyone is interested in this topic, has expertise in this area, and would like to write to the committee, you can find the details for that on the Scottish Parliament website.
Tell us what difference your bill will make to an ordinary person involved in prostitution on all sides, the sellers and the buyers. Let's do it like that.
So in terms of the sellers, what we know is that the majority of the sellers are female. So there are men and boys involved in prostitution, but when I talk about prostitution, I talk about women because it is the majority of them are women. So it's something like 95% of people working in prostitution are female. And I would say that they generally fall into maybe majority two groups, but I'll talk about another one as well. So one group whom I've met are generally women who have entered prostitution very young. This might have been because they were sexually abused as children. It's often to do with getting involved with somebody who then sort of grooms them and becomes their pimp and, violent boyfriends, that type of thing. Or they're in some kind of extremist, which might be financial, and they get involved in prostitution that way. And generally that's on-street prostitution. So people will be familiar with that. If you're my age, you'll remember driving through Edinburgh and seeing women standing in certain parts of town. That type of prostitution is now a real minority compared with indoor prostitution, which is happening in brothels, pop-up brothels, so-called party flats, in apartments all over cities and in much more rural. I think there's also a misconception that it only happens in big cities. That's not the case. There'll almost certainly be some kind of prostitution going on in almost all parts of Scotland, including the rural areas and the islands. And the women that are typically found in those kind of environments are usually trafficked. So they'll be coming from other parts of the world, mostly from Eastern Europe, but not exclusively. There's quite a large source of women being trafficked in from parts of Africa, particularly from parts of Nigeria, and also from Eastern countries like Vietnam and countries and China as well. So those women often have their passports taken away from them. And whilst I think they're, we've seen movies. I think the obvious one is Taken, isn't it, where people are being, grabbed off the street. That does happen, but it doesn't happen very often. So it's more likely that women, let's say from Romania, they know that they're going into prostitution, but they're not quite aware of quite how bad it's going to be, that they're not going to get the money, how much they're going to be coerced and controlled, and how little choice they will have over what's happening to them, really. So averagely, they won't be responsible for doing the adverts, won't be placing the adverts, which then advertises what services, they're supposed to provide. So they won't even know what services are being advertised that they're meant to do, which then very much reduces their ability to negotiate with sex buyers when they come in. What price it will be, they're often surveilled by, pimps and managers who basically do not let them out of their sight. And they have sort of inconsistent violence and treats. So it's been studied and documented, and these pimps and traffickers are basically perpetuating really what would meet the criteria for torture onto these women who are held in these conditions. We can see that in the rates of complex PTSD in women that have come through the trade of prostitution. And when they come out, it's something like 70% of them are displaying the fact that, could be diagnosed as having complex PTSD. And that, just to put into context, that's comparable with combat veterans and victims of state torture. So just to get that in people's heads, that's the reality for most of the women that come through prostitution. But I will say, not all of the women who work in prostitution. And I think because prostitution has become probably less stigmatized than it was perhaps in the past, and we're certainly seeing the rise of media stars, who are involved in this type of thing, which appear to kind of glamorize it and make it seem like, it's an empowered choice and so on. And I'd certainly say that there are some women who certainly present that way. They'd say that they're making a free choice, that they choose who their clients are and so on. But the study that I've seen would put those type of women at around about 2%. And we have to then be aware that the voices that we're listening to in terms of that lived experience, that 2% experience is not the same as the women that I've just explained, that are being trafficked, who have very limited agency over, what they're doing and how they're doing it, are not being paid, and are basically being treated like modern day slaves.
What about the punters, the Johns? What will the bill do regarding them?
Yeah, so if you accept that prostitution is violence against women, which I do, and which many international agencies do, international law, and also the Scottish Government, for instance, and COSLA, they have a joint strategy saying that prostitution is violence against women, then the right thing to do is to try to find a policy and a legislative approach that kind of puts that rhetoric into action. And so the best thing that you can do is to adopt what's called the Nordic model. And it's called that because it was first started in Sweden, and a lot of the Nordic countries have, no, not all, have followed suit, as have a number of countries around the world. And what that does is it accepts that this is violence that's being perpetuated onto women and girls, many of whom have got very, a number of vulnerabilities and are not having free agency of what they're doing, and the dangerous nature of it as well. And it says that actually the buyers are the ones that are perpetuating this system. And so the right thing to do is to have a criminal framework where it is the sex buyers that are criminalized, the sellers are decriminalized, and there's also a quashing of any previous convictions that the sellers might have got while they've been in prostitution. I can talk about that a little bit more about why we might want to do that. And also that make sure that there are appropriate services for women working in prostitution to access, including support to exit if that's what they want.
And what would that exit look like? Because I imagine it's not just a simple case of one size fits all. You'll have all sorts of issues in there: educational, drug dependency, family not being here, and so on.
Yes, it's quite, from what I understand, it's a very complex picture. And there are some really good organisations that work in this area in Scotland, and particularly a Glasgow-based one that Glasgow City Council have been exclusively funding for 30 years, called Roots Out. And they would tell you that working with women in order to get them exiting from prostitution, even when they say they want to, can take a long time. It can take years to get that woman into a position where she's ready and able to leave prostitution. So no, it's not a simple task. It takes committed and specialised services in order to support these women who, as I've explained, could have some very complex trauma, complex family dynamics, etc., things that they need to work through in order to be able to safely exit prostitution.
I can't imagine how difficult that must be for some of these women, especially without the sort of family networks and support that they've had since being trafficked in. It's quite a horrendous picture you're painting. How widespread is prostitution across Scotland?
It's difficult to get good figures, especially because the nature of prostitution has changed, because it's moved from outdoor prostitution, which was much more visible, to this sort of behind closed doors, indoor prostitution, where mainly the victims are trafficked, because they're much less likely to engage with services. They're much less likely to go to drop-ins. They have possibly, language barriers. They may not speak English at all. They may not even know what city they're in. They might not know whether it's safe to go to the police. There's all these factors as well. So it's quite difficult to estimate, but the best estimates that we have, there was a study done, it was a UK-wide study, but if we just based it purely on population share, we could estimate that we think there's somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 people involved in prostitution in Scotland, which is quite high when you think about it.
Yeah, that is really high. It's interesting. I wonder if there's a corollary between prostitution becoming more acceptable and also becoming an indoor practice rather. It's almost as though out of sight, out of mind, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. You know, a lot of people in Scotland wouldn't be seeing any signs of prostitution in their local area. That's definitely true. That's not the case if you live in certain parts of Glasgow, certain parts of Aberdeen, certain parts of Edinburgh. You'll still see on-street prostitution. But actually, I've had a number of constituents write to me over the years who live in, I guess it would be like tenements or blocks of flats, where they'll say that they know that there's flats in their block that are being used for prostitution, and they are seeing streams of buyers going up and down the stairs, you know, all hours of the day and night. And so, you know, there are people in Scotland who are living with this.
So, how optimistic are you?
I am optimistic. I mean, my personal view on this is that the rhetoric that the Scottish government has been putting out for probably the last 10 years with their equally safe strategy, and the fact that they agree that prostitution is violence against women, they agree that you need to really look at demand, so that's buyers, and you need to try to suppress demand. So really, this law matches up very much with what the government says that it believes in and it wants to do. So I can't see a legitimate reason for them not to support it. I just need a simple majority. So I'm obviously having conversations with the other political parties, some of which are going well. So I'm quietly optimistic at the moment. And, you know, you have to be, I think, to put this work into something that you hope is going to be successful. But to my mind, if you want to signal that you care about women, and you want to prevent women being drawn into what is an extremely violent and exploitative system, to my mind, this is a very simple thing to do. And, you know, just by making that statement that, you know, it's not acceptable to buy sex, that it's exploitation, I think is sending the right signal in society that we value women and we care about them, and that we expect certain types of behavior in society, because prostitution has a cost to society. The French, who recently adopted this law, they did it, I think it was in 2016. They were estimating the cost to French society of prostitution and associated work around that was something like 1.6 billion it was costing the country. So why should we be picking up the cost of that? Arguably, we should be passing that on to the buyers. We should be saying to the buyers, you know, you're creating this problem, therefore you're the ones that should be expecting to get criminal sanctions and financial sanctions for this.
It seems fair to me. Do you think this might be taken as a model and used in the rest of the UK?
It's already in force in Northern Ireland, and also another neighbouring country of Ireland has also done it. Norway, France. So we are really getting to the point where we're surrounded by countries that have adopted legislation, you know, similar to the Nordic model. And the other thing that happens there is that when a neighbouring country brings in this legislation, it immediately makes your country a much less attractive for destinations for sex traffickers. So what they do is they'll just go to another country. So the risk to England is that with Northern Ireland and Scotland, if we go on to enact this legislation, that it will in fact make the issue of prostitution worse in England, because it will be seen as a free-for-all, whereas the neighbouring countries were not. So I would like to think that England will look at what Northern Ireland and hopefully Scotland have done, and then think, yes, this is the way we want to go in England as well.
Yeah, I can see the logic there. And I'm also thinking that if a bill makes sex unbuyable, then another knock-on effect could be the online market. Is that something that you've got your sights on?
Well, I think to my mind, this is the place to start with the physical purchase, because that's where people are being harmed. I think that's definitely something that we could look at in the future. But at the moment, I mean, I've only got the Scottish Parliament actually goes to the polls. We dissolve probably around about mid-March next year, because it's the Scottish elections. So we'll be all coming up for election. So this will keep me extremely busy, I think.
I can see that. I can't imagine the amount of work that goes into writing legislation. What is it about Scotland? We were working out the other day that by Christmas we will have had about 30% of our guests on here. I mean, we're only a tiny little snapshot, but 30% of our guests have been from Scotland. Why? Why does this happen in Scotland?
Because we had the gender recognition reform bill in Scotland, I think it kind of necessitated and reinvigorated women's rights, or women's human rights defenders, or feminists, or women's rights campaigners, however you want to describe it, to start up in Scotland, and that's really what's happened. So I think that we're very organised, we're very energised. I think that the campaigners know what works. They're seasoned campaigners now. We've absolutely been through the mill up here. So yeah, but I think it's good to have something else that's, possibly would bring about positive change also to work on. So that's why I'm interested in just seeing if we're able to do this. I know I've got a lot of support from the women's rights campaigners in Scotland for the bill as well.
Yeah, I'm sure you have. I mean, I think that's happened for a lot of us. We've got reinvigorated into feminism through the gender issue, and then we've thought about all the other stuff that needs fixing, and I think that's been really interesting. So the last thing I want to ask you about is Sandy Peggy, because how has that been? Did you get to go?
I've met her. I've seen some of the other women that have pursued this particular fight through the courts, and the strain that it places on you and family members. I don't think people quite understand how much it is to go through. And I felt like I could see that in Sandy when I met with her. So I think she's very brave and courageous to be doing this. And obviously you're opening yourself up to a degree as a private person to this level of sort of criticism of everything you've said and everything you've done. It isn't really about that. It's about a point of law. Did they follow the law, or did they not? On the other hand, though, I think it's that there are certain things that happen that capture the public's attention and paint a picture for the public and let them understand a bit more about what we are talking about in terms of policy, because sometimes the policy argument can feel a bit distant from people. They don't quite understand why are you making a big fuss about that? That's not really. But when you can distill it down to, a 50-something nurse going into a changing room, who might be suffering issues around to do with menopause, and then being confronted with a male-bodied doctor, that's when, for most of the public, they get that then, and they're like, yeah, I understand this. I don't think I like the idea of this. It was a similar effect to what happened with regard to the double rapist in the female prison estate in Scotland. That picture, it explained the issue in a way 100, carefully thought out opinion pieces would never have done. They, really, the public were outraged. And I think the public are equally outraged by, or at least the ones that are following it, what's been going on in the Sandy Peggy case as well. And, I was overhearing people talking about it last time I was at the airport. The people sitting next to me were following it and talking about it. So it has captured the public's attention.
It's been well covered in the Scottish papers as well, because it hasn't been as well covered. I think the Times has covered it on the Scotland pages. I think there's even been something in the Guardian that was not too badly written. But yeah, we're very grateful anyway. So perhaps we shall have to continue being 30% Scottish. So what can the listeners do to help you get this through?
Well, if the listeners are in Scotland, they can get in touch with their member of the Scottish Parliament. That would be really important. You can also get in touch with your MPs, because I don't think it does any harm to, if you've got a Scottish Labour MP, for instance, or an SNP MP, it's a good idea to get in touch with them as well. But it's really MSPs that will have a vote, so it's good to directly contact them. And if you're a constituent, you can ask for a meeting. And most of the time, your constituency MSP will meet with you, because that's good practice. If people ask to meet with me, even if I know they're going to come in and talk to me about something that maybe I'm not as supportive of, I'll still meet with them, because that's your job, is to meet with your constituents and listen to their concerns. So that's a really good thing to do. But if people don't feel confident about that, or they haven't got the time, you just ping them an email. Just say, look, I've seen that this bill's happening. I'm really supportive of it. And can you let me know what your thoughts are? What's your political party's view on this piece of legislation? Are you going to vote for it at stage 1? And just see what they say. And social media is helpful too. If people have got social media accounts and they're able to share things or repost or write new content that supports the principles, that's also really helpful.
Our last question's always the same. We like to push the love forward. your woman of the moment, a woman who inspires you, or women who inspire you. If we asked you tonight because in a previous interview, one with the trans parents, one of the mums named you, and it was so moving because she was talking about being in such a dark place, and you resigned. And I don't think possibly you're thinking of that, the impact when you resign on your on the people out there in Scotland. But this mum said she could breathe. She said I could breathe for a bit, and I thought that was incredibly moving because she just felt that nobody had heard and nobody listened and nobody cared. And then she said to have a politician do that was amazing. So you were her woman of the moment. So throw it forward.
You know, J.K. Rowling had a similar effect as that to me, because at that point when it was very dark and very, very few people were speaking up on that topic because people were just being monstered, they were having their publishing deals revoked, they were being suspended from their jobs. You know, this whole sort of persecution of anybody that dared, mostly women, but not exclusively women, who dared to speak up about this topic. Having those few people who were there, who were speaking out, was important to me as well. So I was looking to people like her and thinking, well, she's saying things. So, and that gave me the sort of strength to want to do it too. So I'm good that I'm pleased that I had that sort of similar effect on some other people. But I would say in terms of women of the moment, it's all the women that have, I think, particularly put their heads above the parapet on this issue, because it has been really hard. And I know not everyone's able to do it, and I understand that. You know, there are some people that just cannot afford to be suspended from their jobs. You know, I totally understand that. But the women that have had the courage to challenge this, to go public about it, and oftentimes at great personal cost to themselves, you know, I really salute them. And we wouldn't be where we are without the women that have chosen to do that, some of whom have become great friends of mine as well, I should say, which has been a good outcome from all of this. And so really for me, I think Forum in Scotland, you know, the 3 women that are in Forum in Scotland, I think they're my sheroes of this movement, because the tenacity to be, you know, ordinary women, mums in Scotland, nothing to do with politics or lobbying or anything, and just to decide, look around you and think no one else is coming to fix this. We've got to do something about it. And then to take, you know, to pursue your government all the way to Supreme Court. Yeah.
It was, what an incredible moment. Where were you?
I was in the Edinburgh group of people. So some of them were in London, and then Trina was in Edinburgh with a group of about 100 of us in Edinburgh. So yeah, it was emotionally charged for sure.
I can imagine. I didn't expect, I was just listening. I was doing I think I was making jam actually. I got my iPod in and I just suddenly punched the air and shouted yes. And my other half was like, what's going on? It was like I was listening to a football match or something, you know. It's such an emotional moment.
So, and you know, that provided so much clarity on the law for everybody in the UK, really, not just for Scotland. But, you know, to have got to that point, it's just incredible that it you know, that those 3 women had that level of perseverance, that they just didn't give up. They right, and they just kept going, and to the benefit of all of us, really. So I take my hat off to them. It's not been easy for them to do that, but I think there's a lot of women in Scotland and further afield that are just so grateful for them and what they've achieved.
Yeah, well, we certainly are, and I think that's a great choice.
Thank you to our listeners. We really hope that you've enjoyed this episode, and if you have, please do like, share, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff to help keep our channel growing and spread the word. Thank you.